There's a moment in every war that historians argue about forever. Not the moment the first shot is fired, not the peace treaty, not the victory parade or the memorial wall or the speeches that come after when everyone's trying to sound brave in hindsight. No, the moment historians argue about is the before moment, the quiet one, the one that nobody photographs because nobody knows yet that it matters. For the galactic conflict of Sector Veil 9, what we now call the Veil Reckoning, that moment happened on a Wednesday. Not a galactic Wednesday, a human Wednesday. I only know this because I asked one of them once, years later, what day of the week it was when their soldiers first touched soil on Kashari Prime. The soldier, her name was Reyes, Corporal Myra Reyes, thought about it for a second, tilted her head slightly to the left the way humans do when they're genuinely trying to remember something, and then said, Wednesday. Yeah, it was definitely a Wednesday. I remember because Martinez complained about it, said he always had the worst days on Wednesdays. That's what I mean about humans. Before I get into the record, and I will get into it, all of it, because this story deserves to be told without cuts, I want to be honest about something. I didn't want humans here. I was one of the Alliance strategists who voted against the proposal to bring them in. Twice. I wrote a 14-page analysis explaining, in technical terms that I was very proud of at the time, exactly why humanity's combat doctrine was too chaotic, too emotionally unpredictable, and too logistically expensive to be integrated into the Kashari defense framework. I was wrong about all of it. What I was really saying, if I'm going to be honest, and I'm old enough now to be honest, was that I was afraid, not of humanity, of what it would mean if humanity worked. Because if these creatures who had only just barely left their own solar system, who still used gunpowder in some of their weapons, who named their military operations things like Operation Iron Fist and Operation Rolling Thunder as if they were writing stories about themselves while simultaneously living inside them. If those creatures walked into the Veil Reckoning and turned it around, what did that say about us? About the Kashari Alliance, with our 6 centuries of military doctrine and our quantum array battle formations, and our 17 species working in supposedly perfect coordination. What did it say about us that we needed them? I didn't want to answer that question. I voted no. I wrote my 14 pages. And then the humans came anyway, because the council overruled me, and I was assigned as their combat historian because my supervisor thought it was funny. It wasn't funny for approximately the first 6 hours. After that, it became the most important assignment of my life. First contact, landing zone Epsilon 7, KSHRI Prime Northern Shelf. The transport came down just after what the humans call 4 in the morning. I know this because I was there, standing at the edge of the landing perimeter in a thermal coat rated for -30 Kashari temperatures, watching my datapad and wishing very badly that I had chosen a different career. The northern shelf of Kashari Prime is not a comfortable place. It's a geological formation, a plateau, roughly 300 kilometers wide, that sits at the convergence of 2 tectonic plates that have been slowly grinding against each other for something like 4 million years. The ground is fractured, unstable in places. The wind comes off the polar sea to the northwest at speeds that make normal conversation impossible unless you're wearing amplified comm gear. The sky at night, and it was absolutely night when the humans arrived, has this quality I've never managed to properly describe. It's not dark the way deep space is dark. It's dark the way the inside of something alive is dark, like you're standing inside a creature that's sleeping. Low clouds, the smell of minerals and cold. Every few minutes, the aurora borealis equivalent of our atmosphere does something in the upper stratosphere, and you get these brief smears of violet-green light that illuminate nothing useful and make everything feel slightly like a dream. This is where we chose to land them. Looking back, I understand the tactical reasoning. The northern shelf was away from the primary population centers. It had solid bedrock beneath the fractured surface layer, which meant heavy equipment wouldn't sink. It was defensible on three sides by natural formations. The Veth, the opposing faction in the reckoning, and I'll get to them in detail soon enough, had not yet established any significant presence north of the 62nd parallel, so the landing zone was considered relatively safe. What nobody in tactical had fully considered, apparently, was what it would look like. When the human transport broke through the cloud cover, it came down hard and fast, much faster than our standard landing protocols, and I learned later this was intentional. Their pilots had been briefed on the possibility of Veth atmospheric interdiction and had developed what they called a hot entry approach, which is exactly what it sounds like. The ship didn't circle. It didn't decelerate gracefully. It came in like something being thrown. The landing struts hit the ground and the whole plateau shook. I stumbled. Two of the Kashari ground crew stumbled. The comms officer next to me dropped her scanner and had to chase it across the frost-hardened ground for a moment. And then the ramp came down. The first human off the transport was not who I expected. I had been given a briefing on the human contingent. 312 soldiers from a joint command that blended several of their national military traditions: American, Korean, Brazilian, Polish, Nigerian, among others. Their commanding officer was a man named Colonel Drayden Holt, 54 years old, decorated in 3 of their planetary conflicts, known in Kashari military intelligence files for being, and I'm quoting directly from the file, methodical, flexible under pressure, and reportedly difficult to rattle. That was the man I expected to walk off the ramp first. Instead, it was a woman, young. Probably by human standards mid-20s, though I've always found human age difficult to estimate accurately. She was shorter than the average soldier in her unit, I'd later learn. Dark hair cut close on the sides, longer on top, currently flattened by the helmet she was wearing. She came off the ramp at a walk, but a specific kind of walk, the kind that has been trained into a person's body over years until it stops being a walk and starts being a statement. She was carrying what I recognized from the briefing as a standard-issue human assault configuration weapon, muzzle pointed down, but her other hand was moving, and this is the detail that stays with me. Her other hand was pulling off a glove. Just the one glove. Right hand. She got to the bottom of the ramp, stepped onto Kashari prime soil for the first time, and pressed her bare palm flat against the ground. She held it there for a moment. Then she stood up, put her glove back on, and stepped clear of the ramp to let the soldiers behind her pass. I asked her about that later, too. She was the same Corporal Reyes who told me it was a Wednesday. I asked her why she touched the ground. She shrugged, said, "You always touch the ground first thing, so you know what you're standing on." I wrote that down. I still have the note. The human contingent, a first impression. Colonel Holt was the 4th person off the ramp, and he looked exactly like his file suggested he would. Tall by human standards, though not remarkably so by galactic scale. He had the kind of face that has been exposed to weather for a long time, not rough exactly, but settled, like a terrain feature that knows what it is. He wore no visible expression as he walked to the edge of the landing zone where our greeting party was assembled, but his eyes were doing the thing I'd come to recognize over the following weeks as one of the most characteristically human behaviors I'd ever observed. He was cataloging. He looked at the sky first, then the ground, then the horizon in a slow sweep that covered about 270 degrees before returning to us. Then, and only then, did he acknowledge our presence. "Colonel Holt," he said, extending a hand to our forward commander, Vice Admiral Tesserin. Tesserin, to her credit, had researched the human gesture and shook it correctly. "Colonel, welcome to Kashari Prime." Holt nodded once. Then he said, "What's the current thermal reading on that ridge?" and pointed to the northeastern escarpment. That was the first question any human asked on Kashari Prime soil. Not "how do you do?" or pleased to be here, or any of the pleasantries that 17 species in our alliance had spent millennia developing as a standard opening protocol. He wanted to know the thermal signature on a ridge he'd apparently noticed during approach, because it might affect sniper positioning or drone deployment, or some other tactical consideration that his brain had already gotten to before his boots hit the ground. Tesserin looked at me. I was standing slightly behind her and to the left. I checked my datapad. -26 current, I said. Drops another 4 degrees approximately 90 minutes before dawn. Holt nodded again, looked back at the ridge. That changes things, he said, mostly to himself. Behind him, the rest of his contingent was offloading equipment with a kind of organized velocity that was, and I don't use this word casually in a military context, beautiful. Not graceful, exactly. Human movement is rarely graceful in the classical sense, but it was purposeful in a way that had its own aesthetic. Every person knew what they were doing. Every crate, every case, every piece of kit moved in a specific direction at a specific pace, and even the communication between soldiers, the quick gestures, the short calls, the way two people could look at each other across a noisy landing zone and exchange an entire conversation in under 2 seconds. All of it had the quality of something practiced until it became instinct. Our liaison officer, a young Velhari named Shin Dale, was standing beside me watching the offload. She leaned toward me and said quietly, "They're faster than I expected." "They're slower than they think they are," said a voice from just behind us. We both turned. It was one of the human soldiers, a stocky man with sergeant's insignia who had apparently walked up during the offload to check the perimeter near our position. He had this expression that I'd come to identify as a human smirk. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, the facial equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "Sergeant Abanachukwu," he said, "don't mind me, just checking sightlines." He glanced at the ridge, the same one Holt had pointed to, then back at us. "You said -26 up there." "Correct," I said. He made a sound, not quite a word, more like a sound humans make when they're filing information away. Then he walked back toward the offload. Shindale watched him go. Then she said, "How did he hear us?" "I don't know," I said. I didn't find out the answer to that until much later. Humans, under sustained stress or in environments they perceive as potentially dangerous, develop a kind of ambient hyper-awareness that most other species find deeply unsettling once they become conscious of it. It's not supernatural. It's physiological, a cascade of sensory amplification triggered by certain stress hormones that are, apparently, almost constantly present in human soldiers operating in forward positions. They are, in the most literal biological sense, hunting at all times, cataloging, processing, filing. They just also laugh and complain, and ask what day of the week it is at the same time. That duality is the part that's hardest to explain to someone who hasn't seen it. The VATH, what we were facing. I should explain the VETH. The history is long and the grievances on both sides are genuine and complicated, and I'm not going to adjudicate any of it here. That's not my purpose in this document. What I need to convey is the tactical reality as it existed when the humans arrived. The VETH Collective had been in conflict with the Kashari Alliance for 11 years at that point. They are a species, a collective of 3 co-evolved subspecies, actually, though they present as a unified political entity, native to a star system approximately 40 light-years from Kashari Prime. They are, by most objective measurements, formidable opponents, larger than most Kashari-affiliated species. Naturally resistant to most conventional energy weapons due to a dermal crystalline matrix that evolved in response to their homeworld's unusual electromagnetic environment. Fast, in burst situations, their neuromuscular response time in threat scenarios is roughly 3 times faster than a Kashari standard, though their sustained endurance is considerably lower. They are also, and this matters for understanding what happened in the reckoning, strategic in a very particular way. The Veth do not take unnecessary risks. They calculate, they model, they run probability assessments on every engagement, and they withdraw from engagements that their models indicate have a net negative expected value. This is not cowardice. It's an adaptive trait that served them extremely well through centuries of their own history, and it made them devastatingly effective as an opponent because they almost never overextended. Against Kashari pattern forces, this had been a winning strategy for 11 years. What the Veth models did not account for, what their entire probability architecture had no framework for, was what happens when you put humans in the equation. Not because humans are individually superior. They're not. A Veth soldier in a one-on-one physical engagement with a human soldier will win the majority of encounters, barring unusual circumstances. Humans know this. The ones in Holt's contingent knew it very explicitly. What the Veth couldn't model is what humans do with that information. Most species, when confronted with an opponent they cannot beat in a direct engagement, either develop better technology, seek numerical advantage, or adjust their doctrine to avoid direct engagement. These are rational, sensible responses. Humans do all three simultaneously, and also come up with a fourth option that doesn't exist in the strategic literature of any species in the known galaxy, which is, find the specific combination of circumstances under which the disadvantage becomes irrelevant, and then manufacture those circumstances, loudly, in real time, while also complaining about the weather and making references to cultural artifacts that nobody else in the theater understands. I'm getting ahead of myself. Hour 1, the briefing. 40 minutes after the transport landed, Colonel Holt's contingent had the forward operating base assembled. Not fully, not with everything operational, but the structural elements were up, the perimeter was established, and his command element was inside a prefab shelter that his engineers had put together with a speed that Vice Admiral Tesserin later described as medically improbable. I was invited into the briefing because I was the combat historian, and Holt, to his credit, seemed to genuinely understand what that function was for. A lot of commanders see historians as parasites, observers who take notes and don't contribute. Holt introduced me to his command team as the person who's going to tell us everything that's happened here before we got here, which was a reasonable and actually quite generous framing. The briefing room, and calling it that is generous. It was a prefab shelter with a folding table and datapads, and someone had taped a physical map to the wall, an actual printed physical map, which I found baffling until someone explained that physical maps don't malfunction when electronic warfare packages are active, held Holt. His executive officer, Major Lena Park, Sergeant Chukwu, who turned out to be leading the reconnaissance element, Corporal Reyes, who was, I learned, something called a cultural liaison NCO, a role that apparently didn't exist in most militaries, but that Holt had invented for this particular deployment, and 4 other officers whose names I'll introduce as they become relevant. Also present, Vice Admiral Tesserin and 2 of her staff officers, representing the Kashari Command. Also present, me, with my datapad and the vague sense that I was about to have my analytical framework shaken loose in ways I wasn't prepared for. Holt started the briefing, "Tell me about the ground." He wasn't asking me. He was asking Chukwu, who had apparently spent the 40 minutes since landing not helping assemble the base, but instead walking the perimeter with a small sensor package and his own 2 eyes. Chukwu spread a printout on the table. He also used physical printouts. Apparently this was a team characteristic, and pointed to 3 positions. Subsurface instability here, here, and here. Ground looks solid, but there's a void underneath, maybe 3 meters down. Anything heavier than a standard vehicle falls through, it's gone. Northern approach, there's an ice shelf about 400 meters out, not visible from the air because the snow cover blends it. Good kill zone if you know it's there, catastrophic surprise if you don't. Vice Admiral Tesserand's senior staff officer, a veteran named Commander Rel, leaned forward. We're aware of both formations. They've been logged in our terrain analysis. Are they logged in your frontline unit briefings? Chukwu asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Rel paused, checked her datapad. The pause lasted long enough to answer the question. Chukwu didn't say anything. He just made that sound again, the filing information away sound, and moved to the next item. That moment, that small, quiet moment, was the first indication I had that the humans were going to change something fundamental about how this war was being fought. Not because they knew something we didn't, but because Chukwu's first instinct upon landing on an unfamiliar planet was to walk it with his feet instead of reading about it on a screen. The Veth pattern I'm seeing in your last 6 months of engagement records, Holt said, picking up the thread, suggests they're using a compressed probe and withdraw cycle. They push to test a position, they pull back when they get contact data, they feed that data into their next push. Each push is incrementally better calibrated. That's correct, Tesserand said. We've identified the pattern. We haven't found a way to disrupt it. You're trying to disrupt it at the push phase, Holt said. That's too late. By the time they push, they've already made the decision and they're committed. You've got to disrupt it at the withdrawal phase, make the withdrawal expensive, make them not want to withdraw. Tesserand frowned. If they don't withdraw, they're committing to an engagement their calculations suggest is unfavorable. They won't do that. No, Holt said. They won't want to. But if withdrawing is also expensive, you've put them in a position where both options are bad. And when both options are bad, Major Park finished the sentence. Their models break down, they have to improvise. And they're not good at improvising, Holt said. There was a silence in the briefing room, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of silence that happens when someone has said something that everyone immediately recognizes as correct and nobody has a counterargument. Commander Rel said, "No, they're not." "So," Holt said, and his voice shifted slightly, took on a quality that I would come to recognize as his planning voice. "Let's talk about how we make withdrawal expensive. The question of fear." I want to stop here, pause the operational record for a moment, because this is where my personal observations become relevant to the historical narrative. In the days after the initial landing and before the first engagement, I had the opportunity to spend significant time with the human contingent in a non-operational capacity. Part of this was my job. Part of it was, if I'm honest, a kind of compulsive anthropological fascination that I couldn't quite suppress even when I tried. There was a night, I think it was the second night, though my notes are slightly unclear on the exact timing, when I couldn't sleep. This is not unusual for me in field conditions. I walked to the edge of the base perimeter and found, not entirely surprisingly, that I was not alone. Corporal Reyes was sitting on a rock formation at the perimeter's edge, looking out at the northern shelf. She had her helmet off. The aurora was doing its thing in the upper atmosphere. She had a device in her hand, small, rectangular, and she was making marks on a physical surface with a thin instrument. Writing. By hand. I sat down nearby. She glanced at me, acknowledged my presence with a small nod, and went back to writing. "Is this permitted?" I asked, "writing outside the perimeter?" "I'm inside the perimeter," she said without looking up, "by about 8 meters. I checked, she was correct. "What are you writing?" I asked. She thought about it for a second. "Letters," she said. "I write letters when I can't sleep." "To who?" "My mom, my brother, a friend from back home." She paused. "I don't send them, I just write them." I didn't fully understand this. I still don't, completely. But I understood enough to not ask follow-up questions about it, because something in her voice suggested that asking follow-up questions would be missing the point. Instead I said, "Are you afraid?" She looked up from the writing then, looked at me directly, which humans do with a frankness that still, after all my time with them, catches me slightly off guard. "Yeah," she said, "a little. Does that concern you?" She went back to writing. "Not really. Little bit of afraid is good, keeps you sharp." Then she said, "Are you afraid?" I thought about it honestly, which is the only way I know how to think about things. "Yes," I said. "What of?" "That we're going to lose," I said. "That we've been losing for 11 years and we're going to keep losing, and what you're about to do isn't going to change that." She was quiet for a moment. The aurora smeared violet green across the sky above us. "You know what my grandfather told me once," she said. "No." "He said the war you win isn't always the one you came to fight." She closed whatever she was writing in. "He was talking about something else, I think, a different war, but it stuck with me." I wrote that down too. Before the storm, what the VETH did not know. The human contingent spent 4 days on the northern shelf before the first engagement. To anyone observing from a strategic distance, this might have looked like preparation, settling in, getting the lay of the land. That's what it looked like to the VETH, according to what we later pieced together from their communications intercepts. Their assessment was that the humans were a new alliance component that required time to integrate into Kashari command structure, that they would be inserted into the existing defensive framework, and that while their presence was a variable that deserved monitoring, it was unlikely to represent a fundamental change in alliance capability. This assessment was completely wrong in a way that I find almost poetic in retrospect. What the humans were actually doing in those 4 days was, and Holt explained this to me much later, creating a mental model of the battlefield that had nothing to do with the existing Kashari defensive framework, because they had identified that the existing framework had a fundamental structural flaw. The Kashari defensive line on the northern shelf was built around a doctrine of holding ground, fixed positions, defined sectors, clear fields of fire. It was a doctrine that made sense against conventional assault, which assumes the attacker wants to control specific terrain features. But the VETH weren't trying to control terrain. They were trying to control information. Each probe was a data collection exercise. They didn't need to hold the northern shelf. They needed to understand it well enough to determine whether it was worth holding, and then, if their models said yes, commit the kind of overwhelming force that would make the alliance's defensive line irrelevant. The Kashari strategy had been, for 11 years, trying to make the defensive line hold long enough to matter. Holt looked at this for 4 days and then said, in a planning session I was present for, "We shouldn't be defending the line. We should be corrupting their data." Major Parks, say more. Holt, every time they probe, they learn something true. We need to make it so that some of what they learn is false. Not all of it. If all of it is false, they figure out the pattern. But if some of it is false, if their model keeps generating predictions that are right about 80% of the time and wrong about 20%, their confidence in the model stays high, but the model is broken. And they won't know it's broken until they commit. There was a long silence. Commander Rel, who had become somewhat more receptive to human tactical input over the preceding days, said, "How do you corrupt data without them detecting the pattern of corruption?" Holt looked at Chukwu. Chukwu had a map out, a physical one. "Randomize it," he said. "Not systematic deception, random noise. Some positions we man full strength. Some we man with half strength but use thermal emitters to make them look full. Some we abandon entirely but leave signature markers. No pattern, pure noise. Their model can't filter signal from noise if the noise distribution mimics signal distribution." Rel stared at the map for a long time. Then she said something I also wrote down and still have. "In 11 years, no one has suggested this." "We're new here," Chukwu said. That same ghost of a smirk. "The first engagement, dawn plus 9 days. It took the VETH 9 days from the human arrival, to mount what our analysts assessed as a serious probe of the northern shelf positions. I was awake when it started. Everyone was, because Chukwu's reconnaissance element had been running what they called a passive acoustic perimeter, an array of sensor nodes tuned to ground vibration, and the system triggered alert at approximately what humans would call 3:15 in the morning, which is, I was informed by Sergeant Chukwu, the worst time for everything. The Veth probe came from two directions simultaneously, which was new. Their previous pattern had always been single-axis probes. The dual-axis approach suggested their models had been updated to account for the Alliance's known weakness in coordinated response across multiple vectors. What their models had not accounted for was that we'd spent 9 days deliberately creating false information about which positions were coordinated and which were independent. The false positions fell first. Not because of poor fighting, there were actual soldiers in most of them, just fewer than the Veth anticipated based on their thermal data, but because Holt had given explicit orders that false positions were to fall in exactly the time frame the Veth models would predict for their actual strength. No heroic stands, no last-ditch defense. Fall, withdraw, and fall in the right way at the right speed, so that the Veth's model said confirmed, accurate assessment. The Veth pressed harder on both axes. Their models said the Alliance line was crumbling on schedule. And then they hit the real positions. The real positions were not where the Veth models said they would be. They were not in the obvious defensive terrain features, the ridgelines, the elevated rocky outcroppings, the natural choke points that every military doctrine in the known galaxy identifies as preferred defensive positions. They were in the awkward places. The places that a model would assess as tactically suboptimal and therefore unlikely to be occupied in strength. Sergeant Chukwu's reconnaissance element was in a dry riverbed that their thermal analysis had flagged as too exposed. Except Chukwu had spent 4 days figuring out that the prevailing wind direction created a dead zone in the Veth sensor coverage from that exact position. Corporal Reyes' section was in a subsurface cavity, one of the voids that Chukwu had identified on the first night, the ones that would swallow anything heavier than a standard vehicle, accessed through a narrow fault in the rock face that didn't show up on any sensor the Veth was running, because it was too small to register as a significant geological feature. Major Park had the heavy element, the platform weapons and crew-served systems, positioned in a location that the Veth's probe had already cleared 2 days earlier, because Holt had deliberately abandoned it early and then quietly reoccupied it after the Veth pulled their sensor assets off it. The Veth's second wave, the one that was supposed to exploit the gaps the probe had identified, walked into a battlefield that bore no resemblance to the one their models described. I was in the command shelter when the engagement reports started coming in. I was watching Holt's face as he processed them. This is something I'll try to describe accurately because I think it matters for the historical record. He wasn't excited. That's the thing that surprised me. He wasn't triumphant or energized. His face was still. He was listening to the report's audio from multiple positions, data feeds, sector updates, and his head moved very slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way it moved when he was cataloging, processing, building the picture. One of his communications officers, a young man named Private Tomas Breck, said, "Sir, Ray's element is reporting heavy contact, Sector 4. Requesting." "Tell her to hold," Holt said. "Calm, completely calm. Another 40 seconds. 40 seconds in an active engagement is... I don't know how to adequately convey this to a civilian reader, but suffice to say that 40 seconds is an extremely long time to ask a unit in heavy contact to hold without support." Breck relayed the order. 37 seconds later, Chukwu's element opened up from the dry riverbed on the flank of the Veth force pressing toward Reyes' position, at a range, an angle that the Veth had no defensive posture covering, because their models said nothing was there. The Veth second wave fractured. Not rooted, they're too disciplined for pure rout, but fractured. The coherent assault formation broke into isolated elements as individual units responded to the unexpected contact, and isolated Veth elements are very different from coordinated Veth formations. The crystalline dermal matrix that makes them resistant to energy weapons doesn't help much against the kind of close, chaotic engagement that happens when a coordinated assault suddenly becomes a disorganized melee. The Northern Shelf probe ended before dawn. The Veth withdrew. But they withdrew slowly, deliberately, not with the clean, decisive withdrawal their doctrine called for. They withdrew because they had to, not because their models told them to, and that's a different kind of withdrawal entirely. That's the kind of withdrawal that tells you something is broken in the machine. Aftermath, counting the cost. We lost 11 people in the first engagement. Not humans, our forces, Alliance forces, the soldiers in the false positions who had fallen according to Holt's plan. This is important to say clearly, because it's easy to make this kind of tactical story sound clean. It wasn't clean. 11 people died so that the Veth models would believe what we wanted them to believe. Every one of them knew the position they were holding was a deception position. Every one of them had volunteered for it. I had asked Holt, the night before the engagement, how he felt about that, about ordering people into positions designed to fail. He was quiet for a moment, longer than he usually was with questions. "I hate it," he said finally. "I'm going to hate it for the rest of my life." "Then why?" "Because the alternative is more of them die over a longer period. That doesn't make this feel okay. I'm just telling you the math." He looked at me with that settled terrain face. "I've done this math before," he said. "I'll do it again. The day it stops bothering me is the day I'm done." I wrote that down too. After the engagement, there was a period of about 6 hours where the Northern Shelf was quiet. The Veth hadn't pulled back completely. Their monitoring assets were still present, still watching, but the active pressure had stopped. I walked the positions. I do this after engagements. It's part of the historian's function, recording the physical reality of a battlefield before it changes. What I found was not what I expected. The human soldiers in the aftermath of their first engagement on alien soil were not celebrating. Some of them were. A few small pockets of people sitting together, talking quietly with the particular intensity of people who have just survived something and are still processing that fact. But the majority were working. Chukwu's element was already repositioning, moving to the next set of suboptimal-looking terrain features, the ones that Chukwu had already identified as the next logical deception positions for the next probe. Reyes was sitting against a rock face, writing in whatever she wrote in, even after the engagement, writing. I stopped near her. She looked up. "You okay?" she asked. "That's my question," I said. She thought about it the same way she'd thought about being afraid, genuinely, without performing the answer. "Mostly," she said. "Ask me again in a week." Then she said, "They'll come back." "I know," I said. "They'll come back different," she said. "They'll know their model was wrong. They'll try to figure out why. And when they do..." She looked out at the Northern Shelf. The aurora was gone now. It was daytime. The sky the peculiar pale copper gray of Kashari Prime's winter mornings. Then we have to be different too. The second phase, what humans call escalation. The Veth came back 11 days after the first engagement. They came back different. What they brought with them was, by any tactical standard, a significant upgrade. Not in numbers, their force size was comparable to the first probe, but in approach. They had spent 11 days analyzing what had gone wrong with their models, and they had arrived at a partial answer. Their sensor coverage had been defeated by human positioning choices that didn't conform to standard doctrinal patterns. Their solution was to increase sensor coverage density, by an order of magnitude, and to run a preliminary saturation sweep before any assault element committed. This was genuinely clever. I want to acknowledge that. The Veth are not stupid. They identified the problem accurately and designed a solution that should have worked. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that in those 11 days, Chukwu's element had mapped every single sensor platform in the Veth's coverage array. Not by hacking it, not by electronic warfare, but by watching it. Physical observation. 3 humans in 2-person rotating shifts, lying on the frost-hardened ground in thermal camouflage, watching through optical systems and recording every sensor movement, every rotation cycle, every coverage gap. This is not something that exists in standard military doctrine. It requires a patience and a tolerance for physical discomfort that most species don't sustain over 11 days of lying on frozen ground. Humans apparently can sustain it. How do you do that? I asked Chukwu after the second engagement. 11 days. You get into a rhythm, he said. You stop thinking about the cold, you stop thinking about your body, you just watch. That sounds, I tried to find the word. Boring, he said, and the smirk was back. It is boring, that's the point. You get bored enough and your brain shuts down everything, except what you're actually supposed to be doing. I filed that away with the rest of it. The second engagement was different from the first in almost every detail except the outcome. The Veth's improved sensor sweep found most of our deception positions. That was expected. What it didn't find was the new set of positions that Chukwu had established in the 11 days since the first engagement, using the coverage gaps he'd mapped. Positions that the Veth sensors looked directly past because of the specific angles of approach their coverage architecture created. The Veth's second assault was more coordinated and more powerful than the first. It was also more wrong, because their model was built on better sensor data that still wasn't accurate. Major Park's heavy element, now repositioned to a third location that had been cleared by the Veth's preliminary sweep, opened fire at a range that the Veth command element, positioned where it was because their models said it was a safe distance from any Alliance weapons system, had not accounted for. The second probe ended faster than the first. The Veth withdrew again. This time the withdrawal was faster, sharper, the kind that happens when a command element is under direct pressure. Major Park later described it simply. Once they realized their command node was in range, they had about 30 seconds of good decision-making left before survival instinct took over. We gave them 15. What changed? The moment the galaxy noticed. The battles on the northern shelf were not, by the scale of the Veil Reckoning, large engagements. They involved small numbers of forces on both sides. The territory in question was strategically significant but not decisive on its own. What made them matter wasn't the tactical outcome. It was what the tactical outcome meant. The Veth Collective, in 11 years of conflict with the Kashari Alliance, had never had their models fail them twice in the same theater with the same opponent inside 30 days. Their doctrine was built on the understanding that opponents who understood they were being outmodeled would do one of several predictable things: reinforce fixed positions, call for large-scale reinforcement, request negotiated withdrawal, or collapse. Holt's contingent had done none of these things. They had instead done something the Veth had no category for in their strategic taxonomy. They had treated the Veth's models as a resource to be exploited. This is subtle, so I want to be clear about it. The Veth models existed to help the Veth win engagements, but Holt understood that a model is only as good as the data it runs on. If you can control what data the model receives, if you can make the model predict what you want it to predict, then the model stops being the Veth's tool and starts being yours. The Veth's strategic advantage was not their physical capabilities or their numbers. It was the accuracy of their predictive models. and Holt had spent 20 days systematically destroying that accuracy without the Veth knowing it was being destroyed. When word of this reached the broader galactic command structure, and it did reach them, because the communications intercepts from the second engagement showed the Veth command element using language that our analysts flagged as indicating strategic confusion rather than tactical setback. The reaction was not what I expected. I expected satisfaction, vindication, the kind of institutional self-congratulation that happens when a strategy works. What I observed instead was a very long silence in the Kashari High Command channel, and then a message from the Supreme Allied Commander to Vice Admiral Tesseran that read, in its entirety, "Ask the humans what they need. ORVENDASSALI. Personal Statement, End of Part 1. I'm going to stop the formal record here for a moment. This document is classified for public historical access, which means what I'm about to say is going on the permanent record, and I want to be careful with my words because they're going to last longer than I will. I was wrong about the humans. I want to be specific about how I was wrong, because there's a version of this story that makes humanity sound superhuman, inevitable, unstoppable, the great galactic equalizer, and that version is a myth. It flattens the reality of what I saw. The reality is considerably more human than that, and that's actually the whole point. The humans I watched in those early days on Kashari Prime were afraid. They were cold. They complained, quietly and with remarkable creativity, about everything from the food supplies to the communication equipment to the quality of the prefab shelter insulation. Corporal Reyes wrote letters she didn't send. Sergeant Chukwu made that sound, that filing away sound, dozens of times a day, as a way of processing a world that his body found deeply uncomfortable, even while his mind was fully engaged with understanding it. Colonel Holt, who I eventually came to regard as one of the most functionally brilliant tactical minds I'd encountered in 30 years of combat history, told me he hated himself every time he made the decision to sacrifice a position, and I believed him completely. None of them were performing bravery. None of them were performing confidence. They were just doing it, whatever it was at any given moment, analyzing the ridge, walking the ground, lying on frozen earth for 11 days watching sensor platforms rotate, writing letters, making plans. Making different plans when the first plan stopped working, asking each other what day of the week it was. What I had called chaotic in my 14-page analysis was actually adaptive. The difference between chaos and adaptation is whether there's a purpose underneath the unpredictability. Chaotic unpredictability has no direction. Adaptive unpredictability has a direction. It's just not the direction you expected. The Veth's models were looking for the expected direction and finding chaos. What was actually happening was adaptation so fast and so organic that it genuinely looked like chaos from the outside. The Kashari Alliance had been fighting the Veth for 11 years, using doctrine designed for opponents who fight the way the doctrine expects. The Veth are good enough at what they do that they had turned those 11 years into a grinding standoff. Not a defeat for us, but not a victory either. What humans brought, what Holt brought, and Chukwu brought, and Reyes brought, and Park and Breck, and every one of those 312 soldiers brought, was not better weapons or greater numbers or more advanced technology. What they brought was a refusal to fight the war the Veth expected them to fight. And then, and this is the part that I think is going to matter to historians for a long, long time, they brought the patience to wait for the moment when their refusal became the Veth's problem. I've been a combat historian for 30 years. I've studied more engagements than I can count. I've tried to understand how wars turn, what the pivot moment is, whether it's a technology or a commander or a single decision or just dumb luck. Here's what I think, after everything I've seen. Wars turn when one side stops fighting the war they're in and starts fighting the war they want. And humans are, in my observation, The only species I've ever encountered that does this instinctively, naturally, almost without thinking about it, as if the entire weight of their history as a species that survived things it shouldn't have survived has wired them to always look for the different version of the situation. The one where the rules are different. The one where their limitations become irrelevant. The Veth walked onto the northern shelf with a model. The humans walked onto the northern shelf with a question. The question was, what kind of war could we fight here that they don't know how to fight back against? That question is the beginning of the legacy. This is only part 1.